All right, what do we remember about David from last week? Man after God's own heart. He killed a giant. What else? He wrote some stuff. Not the song we sang today. I was in the death metal camp, if you had a question. That was my comment. Don't judge me, please. He wrote some stuff. What else did he do? Killed a lion and a bear. Smallest of his brothers. Anointed king when he killed the Goliath. What else? Shepherd. Was he married? Not at that point, but he was married eventually. Did he have some trouble in his marriage? Did he cause his trouble in his marriage? Yeah. Okay. All right. So as we jump into this story today, we are going to be reminded, this is what we talked about last week, but we are going to be reminded of something that is relevant to us either today, tomorrow, or down the future. It might be this season of your life, it might be a few months away, it might be a few years, but it will be relevant. Here's what we're going to discover. It's this here. It's the ways of God are most unappealing and seemingly irrelevant when we are angry, isolated, or afraid. And some of you are like, I came to be lifted up. Well, you're going to be here eventually. With this many people, some of you are angry right now. Some of you are afraid, and there are some of you that are probably isolated. Unfortunately, one of these three will probably be part of your future regret as well. Because when these things happen, we make bad decisions. And the reason is this: when we're part of these conditions, we're overwhelmed with emotions that are associated with these conditions. We feel compelled to do something. Have you ever felt like, I've just got to do something? I've got to do something. I've got to move. I've got to fix something. I've got to try to do this on my own. There's almost this sense of panic that I just got to do something. If I do something, it'll release the tension. Well, that's not always what happens. These three conditions have the power to undermine the resolve of even the most dedicated, devout, and disciplined among us. You've seen it happen. You've seen people that are afraid, isolated, and angry go from a great spot in their life to the basement. They can cause us to crash through every moral that we have. They contribute to some of our greatest regrets in life. And will be part of future regrets because we feel compelled to do something. And that something very easily turns into, I need to do anything. I think I need to control the situation. We rely on instinct, and instinct comes naturally to you. I understand that. Because instinct sometimes would go back to what's worked before, and the situation last time is probably different than this time. We often make decisions that complicate our lives. If you've made a decision that's complicated your life, go ahead and raise your hand. Few of us are honest. The rest of you, we're praying for you. Decisions that have consequences far worse than the pain associated with loneliness, fear, or rejection. Because when you start to panic, you do not so smart things. These consequences often leave us feeling more lonely, afraid, or rejected. Have you been there? Have you done that? I have. How many of you have been in a canoe? Few of us. You're laughing. Did you make it out? Did you get wet? It's a long story. We don't have time for it. But if you're in a canoe, the goal is to stay steady and balanced. I'm not saying kayak, I'm saying canoe. There's a difference. Kayak, you can go crazy in that thing and most of the time be okay. But a canoe, you start wobbling that thing a little bit, and then you try to put a little too much pressure. Right away, what happens? It tips right over. That's what life is. Sometimes it is just to stay focused and keep our eyes on Christ instead of us trying to control everything. through life, I've watched otherwise discerning, intelligent people make bad, life-complicating decisions when these emotions start to build up. I think these are solid people. I'd go to them for advice. Unless they're in the middle of this, then I wouldn't ask them anything because they can't make a decision. They can't make a good decision. So let's go back to David because that's where we're going to go. We left it off last week. David was the champion. He had just killed Goliath. He had cut his head off. It was good for David. He was David the legend at that point. He was the winner. So David, we're going to look at the story. David's around 20 to 22. He was 15 before, so 20 to 22. And at this point, the king didn't really like David. Why? He was jealous because Saul had killed his thousands and David had killed his. Have you ever compared yourself to someone? How's that go? The comparison trap. Don't do it. That's not the message, but that's free. Don't do it. So Saul he would go through the cycle where he kind of liked David and then he didn't, and he just became more and more jealous. He was so jelly that he had a plan. And what was his plan? His plan was, I'm going to keep this enemy really close. So why don't you marry my daughter, right? That's what he says. Why don't you marry my daughter? Well, most people would be flattered, but not David. David's like, I come from the lowliest of places. I am not worthy to marry your daughter. So what do people think? They like him even more because he's humble. Have you even noticed that when people are humble, it just goes such a long way? Well, eventually he does marry one of the king's daughters. And he's this folk hero, this killing Philistine champion. And Saul wanted him so dead that at one point he actually threw a spear at him. The Bible says he hurled a spear at him. So do you have Sunday dinners? They had dinners a lot. There's a lot of eating in the Old Testament. So David stopped showing up for family dinner. Do you blame him? Really? He's eating with his father-in-law who doesn't like him, who knows that his anointing has left him and gone to David at this point. Pretty much everything that David touches, he does really well. So in the middle of this, the king sends David out on these mission impossibles, and what's David do? He succeeds over and over again. He does these great things in the name of God. So David wasn't at this dinner, though. So Saul said to Jonathan, who was David's BFF is what we're looking for. Don't best friend me. It's BFF. We're way past that. BFF. And he's like, so where is he? What's he do? Makes up some story. Makes up a story. Jonathan covered for him. And Saul kind of sensed this. And at this time, he realized that his family was conspiring against him. Because at this point, they had realized that David was the normal one, Saul was the crazy one. Right? It's all going to change, though. 1 Samuel 20, 30 to 31 is where we're going to go. We're going to be bouncing all over in 1 Samuel. If you have YouVersion, I have the scriptures are all in there if you look at our events. But it says, Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman. Don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse, to your own shame and to the shame of your mother who bore you?" He's not only picking on Jonathan, he's picking at his mom. "As long as the son of Jesse lives on earth, neither you or your kingdom will be established." Because in his mind, somehow, he was still thinking that the kingdom was going through his blood. A little bit arrogant, a little bit jealous. He says, "Now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die." He's going to kill him. So Jonathan, you can read this again in Scripture, but basically Jonathan says to David, "David, you need to leave. Things are getting pretty hot. You need to get out of here because Dad's craziness is reaching new levels." David was about 22 at this point. Now, David ended up being, this is where it turns, the story goes bad. David was alone, afraid for his life, rejected by the man and the nation that he had bled for. Remember, he was going out on campaigns and winning. Remember, we talked about battle last week, and battle was close. It was a very close battle, and it was very personal. He said, at 15, he said, I'll fight the giant. You fight the fight? I'll fight the fight. He was fine with that. And all of a sudden, all of those things that he did, because he delivered them, he calmed the king down, the king wants him dead. Have you felt betrayed? Has that ever happened in your life? He was isolated, angry, and afraid. And yet, at this point, he hadn't done anything wrong. David was living a pretty good life. But he panicked and he entered survival mode. 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 4. David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, And so he runs, and you see, Jerusalem wasn't part of Israel yet. So he went there because the ark was moving, and basically that's where he was going. And when he got there, he talked to the priest, and the priest says, David, why are you here? What's going on? Why are you alone? Have you ever done something alone that you thought maybe wasn't a great idea? David didn't ask for counsel. He just kind of ran away. So why are you alone? So remember, David is in panic mode. In panic mode, we do things that are not so smart, that are not so godly, and it corrupts morals sometimes. He lies. He's against lying because he likes the law, but he lies. He was afraid. So much for the ways of God that he had given his life to. In a second, he turns his back on those. It says, the king sent me on a mission and said to me, no one is to know anything about the mission that I am sending you on. That didn't happen. He just made that up. As for my men, there's no men. Because David traveled with some men, right? There's no men. But as for my men, they're going to meet me at a secret place. He lies again. He was just afraid. And he was afraid he wouldn't get help if he didn't have a story. Because if you've ever lied, some of us are just good liars. I was never that good at lying. It's not my thing. But some people, they know how to lie. They give you enough detail. You're like, yeah, I believe that. Oh, wow, really? It was a raccoon with 3 legs, and you hit that. Huh, okay, whatever. It's a lot of detail to just make that up, but so that's where David is. Down the line, though, this lie is going to cost the priest and his family their lives. So David goes and he says, now then, what do you have on hand? What can you give me here? I need something. I'm running for my life. Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you have. But the priest answered David. He said, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. I don't have anything that's just laying around in the cupboards, nothing in the storehouses. But there's some consecrated bread here. Bread for the priests, right? Provided, now you can only eat this bread if you've kept yourself from women. So every Sabbath, the bread was put on the altar to God, and when it was replaced, the priest would eat it. But since it was this dedicated to God, only ceremonial clean could eat it or touch it. Now, this is where David gets kind of crafty. He's depending on David. This is the guy who went up against Goliath, and all of a sudden he's lying for bread. Think of that for just a minute. He's lying for bread. He's got his own ingenuity and cunning to get his needs met. He forgot this. He forgot that what God has the power to arrange, he has the power to sustain. He didn't have the sustaining power in him. Because God had taken him really from being a nobody, right? He was a shepherd. Nobody really knew much about David. So he was a nobody to being the legend. the most popular person in the world at that point. So he's anointed king, and because of that, he had this pressure. And his pressure was to stay ahead of the game, to maintain his position. Before, he was humble. Now he's not. So he lied about the food, and then David said, "Don't you have a sword or a spear here? I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon. I'm on a secret mission, but I came without a weapon." Now, that's not very believable again. He's not the greatest liar. But he's like, I didn't come with anything. But the king's mission was so urgent, I couldn't go get a sword, and he didn't send me with a sword. The priest replied, "Well, we've got this sword in the back." Do you remember whose sword it is? You do. It's Goliath's sword. Sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley. So can you imagine? David is running. He's not sure what to do. He's panicked. And then there's this God moment. This is a total, like a God juke. If we're going to say Jesus juke, oh yeah, this is when God was really faithful to you. Boom. Remember that? And this is David's chance. It's his chance to be like, oh my, I am so sorry. I am not putting my faith in God. I am trying to fix this on my own. What does he do, though? He's like, "Give me that bad boy." And he's just walking with it. I'm going to go. Where's he go? He keeps moving, right? So what happened to this clear-eyed, courageous kid, this God-fearing shepherd boy? You see, he was reminded right then and that afternoon that he did this unthinkable thing. Wandered into the valley, killed a giant, cut his head off with this sword. Don't forget what God has brought you through is the lesson for you there. You have testimonies, you have things, and sometimes life gets so overwhelming in our head, that's all we can see is that stuff. And we don't look back to where God was faithful, where God provided. That's what the mistake was here. 1 Samuel 17, if we take a couple chapters back, all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. Guess who said that? David. He said that, he forgot it. Now, he was the kid that ran towards the battle, and all of a sudden, he's running away. So what happened to him? Fear, angry, loneliness. Fear, angry, loneliness. Those three giants have the potential to cause us to forget the defeated giants of our past. Have you noticed that fear changes your vision? Fear drove David to sin. He fled because he was afraid of Saul. Fear is always the enemy of your faith. That is the battleground of the Christian experience. Our eyes are easily clouded with anger. Ecclesiastes, control your temper, for anger labels you a fool. And loneliness causes all kinds of doubts. But to doubt God and question his motives causes our faith to shrink until literally we cease to be believers. Oh, don't get me wrong. You still call yourself a believer, but you quit believing months ago because we quit practicing it. Because what happens is we start to try to control the outcome. We don't walk by faith. We walk by things that we can control. I know about 85% of what I can control in this world. The other 15, I'm pretty good at moving my direction. You know the same thing, but that doesn't take faith. There's no faith involved in that. We are called to walk in faith. David was called to walk in faith. This is his mistake. You see, David was looking at God through opposition and trouble instead of the hope that he had in the valley. He had a hope when he walked in that valley. I think that when he walked through it, he actually had a little bit of a strut in his step. Like he was ready. And now he's cowering and he's running. 1 Samuel 21:9. The priest replied, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, who you killed in the valleys here. It's wrapped in the cloth before the ephod. If you want it, take it. There is no sword here but that one." When David goes and grabs that sword, this is the beginning of a decision that he will regret for the rest of his life. It became a permanent part of his story. David said, "There is nothing like that. Give it to me." David, do you realize you beat him with a slingshot? Right? There's nothing like that. The giant had the weapon. You still won. So I think you're wrong. Cloudy vision. So what David did is he took matters into his own hands. He lied, and he fled away from crazy King Saul, right? You know that's what happened. He took matters into his own hands with a sword that was last wielded by a warrior that was beat by a slingshot. That's his plan. So he has a flawed weapon. That is not the weapon that he should have used because he immediately put his faith in that weapon and not in God. So he has this flawed weapon. God should have been his weapon, but he was looking at Goliath's sword. He has a flawed response. What is he putting his trust in? Weapon. And then we get a disastrous outcome out of it. There we are. When we need God most, sometimes that's when we are least likely to lean in. We opt for things that never worked before, past experiences that didn't get us to where we are, things that often lead to regret, but we think, well, maybe one more time I need to try it because maybe this is the time if I do that, it'll work. But maybe we have neglected the daily time with God, understanding his grace and his power in our life, and not thinking about that because when trouble comes, and you feel lonely, we should run to God and not away from God. When you get angry, you can talk to God. You can write a psalm. Get your journal out and start journaling. Those things are good to do. We're not going to read it from here, so don't worry about it. Church, your Christianity is inadequate if it cannot stand the examination of everyday life and make it through it. It's true. Your faith should get you through the daily life. You might get beat up, but you should have faith in your daily life. David's didn't. He left his faith and went to try to do something on his own. He put his faith in himself. He put himself in the sword. Sometimes we can see that in others. It's easy. Like, man, look at what they're doing. They're kind of self-destructing. Have you ever watched someone self-destruct and you're like, man, that's kind of ugly, right? But self-destruction isn't always easy to see in the mirror. You don't walk by the mirror and like, man, your life's a wreck. Wave your hand, oh, that's me. You don't do that a lot. Because, of course, your situation is different. You're special. You're not special. If you think I'm going to tell you you're special, I'm the wrong person. You're not special. That's what David thought. He thought, I'm so special, I'm going to run crazy out of here, and God's going to bless my sin. Sorry. You're special in God's eyes, but your circumstances, everybody's been through it. Think of the odds. If we have a math person here, chances are someone's gone through what you've done. We start to question something like this. If God were with me, this wouldn't be happening to me. Right? It's easy to trust God when we have nothing to trust him with. Let me say that again. It's easy to trust God when we have nothing to trust him with and nothing to trust him for. It's pretty easy. But it's harder to trust him when something of value starts slipping away. That's when it becomes real. So David takes a sword. Where does he take the sword? It's so comical. Like this is a comedy. Dragging the sword. I can just see him dragging the sword, and then he knocks. He's like, "Oh, Philistines! This is the sword I killed Goliath with, but can I hang with you?" Does that make any sense? These are the enemies of God who don't have a covenant with God. He said in 1 Samuel 17, and now all of a sudden he's like, "Hey, I'm David. I don't know if you've heard of me. I've got this sword." They don't trust him. Oh, really? Surprise, David. Maybe you should have left the sword that you used to kill their best warrior outside. Bury that thing. So what does he do? Gets even better. He fakes insanity, because that's what you do. Starts scratching at the door like a dog. Starts drooling, says drooling down his beard. If you didn't know if David had a beard, the Bible says he had a beard. Probably a real beard, not like this thing I've got here. He's drooling down there. Finally, he's done. He's like, "I got to get out of here." He flees and finds himself in a cave. He's like, "I'm done. I'm going to go hide in a cave." And eventually he finds a prophet and asks, "What would God have me do?" But it's too late. He went through all of these different steps, trying to do things, trying to take care of things, trying to control the outcome, when he should have started with this question, what would God have me to do? But there's other people in this world. Saul's chief herdsman saw David with the priest, and he reports to Saul. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. He also gave him provisions and the sword of Goliath the Philistine, he said. He said, "Listen, this is what he's doing." He went, he talked to the priest, he gave him some food, and then he gave him the sword. Then the king sent for the priest and all the men of his family who were the priests at Nob, and they all came to the king. So he brings everybody together. This is Saul. David is not here right now. But this is because of the priest helping David, because he was listening to David who was lying to him. Okay? Your sins and my sins will have consequences. This is a consequence. Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him, so that he has rebelled against me and lies in wait for me as he does today?" Ahimelech answered the king, "Who of all your servants is as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard and highly respected in your household? Was that day the first time I inquired of God of him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant or any of his father's family, for your servant knows nothing at all about this whole affair." He's like, "I'm not in your drama. I'm not part of that." But the king said, "You will surely die, you and your whole family." Then the king ordered the guards at his side, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they have too sided with David." Delusions of grandeur, Saul. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me. Saul had 85 priests killed. Did he stop there? Nope. He ordered the death of everyone, men, women, children. Done. But one of the priest's sons, one of Ahimelech's sons, flees and makes it to David. And he tells him what happens. And David says in 1 Samuel 22:22, "I am responsible for the death of your whole family." I am responsible for the death of your whole family. Taking matters into our own hands, sometimes it feels good, especially if you like to control things a little bit, but it rarely turns out good. One of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, what is your loneliness, anger, or fear causing you to consider that you've never considered before? Because it can push you in decisions. And remember, you start to think about them, and the first time you're like, that's kind of crazy. I'm not going to do that. And then the second time you're like, that's not as crazy the second time because I've already been through this and I've brought it back into my mind. And the third time you're thinking, how am I going to get this done? That's the process sometimes. Who is your loneliness, anger, or fear causing you to consider that you know you shouldn't consider in your life? Who you're bringing into your life because of those things? Who besides you do your considerations put at risk? Remember, if this was David, if David would have been killed, it would have been one person. If he would have faced what was going on, worst case scenario, David died. That's the worst case scenario for David. Maybe his wife. But you make decisions, and sometimes your decisions are affecting other people. One of the things that we've talked about off and on is it's the 4-generation slide of not going to church. And that looks like if you have a household and you go to church, then chances are your kids are probably going to go to church. However, if they only go part of the time, then their generation is going to go less than part of the time, which is about 30%, if they go at all. And then their kids quit going. So in 4 generations, you can stop your faith from being passed on. Talk about decisions. That's how fast things happen. What advice would you give someone who is you? Think about that. What advice would you give someone who is you? I know what David would do because he walked through this. He wrote it in his journal. In his journal, we call the book Psalms. Psalm 9, I opened with this today, 9:9. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. I think his advice would be run to him, not away from him. David might be saying, I took refuge in my ability because I killed Goliath, because I was somewhat special, even though I didn't realize that before every battle that I went to and every mission impossible that I went to, God was with me. I tried to control those outcomes, and you know what? Without God, they were a disaster. Nothing short of a disaster. Verse 10 goes on, those who know your name trust in you, for you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. You are not forsaken. Facing trials is how you escape them. Sometimes we feel like we're forsaken, but you're really just mistaken. You're not. God will use those trials often before he removes them. Now remember, 1,000 years later, plus or minus, David's most famous descendant would look into the eyes of frightened, overtaxed, seemingly abandoned Israelites and say this, come to me, all you are weary and burdened. And burden means loaded up so that you cannot. Taking those steps is so much work that you can't take anymore. And I will give you rest. The Greek word kind of says, I will rest you. I will rest you. You will be so full of my rest that you don't have to do anything except just kind of soak in it. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy. That word can be translated, my yoke is pleasant, and my burden is light. When you feel forsaken, you are mistaken. Don't run. Remember, don't move until you are led. Wait. Wait. You can seek counsel while you wait. You can read the Bible while you wait. You're not waiting and doing nothing. But don't panic. God is with you. Look for the reminder. David had the reminder. It was there. He just didn't pay attention. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. That's your memory verse for the week. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. Let's stand, church. Next week, we're continuing in the life of David. Gets better. Who would have thought?